and welcome to another episode of Racial Equity in Richmond. I'm your host, Ebony Walden, and this is a component of the Richmond Racial Equity Essays Project, where I'm asking Richmonders from all walks of life to respond to the questions of what's their vision for racial equity, and from their expertise and perspectives, how do we get there? For today's episode, we have Dr. Chaz Barracks. So excited that you're with us here today, Chaz, and I know that we're going to have a dynamic and fruitful conversation. So to jump right into the conversation, just kind of give us a brief introduction of yourself. Obviously, your name. What is it that you do in the daytime? How would you characterize that quickly? And then how long have you been living in our beloved city of Richmond?
So thank you for having me, Ebony. My name is Chaz. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. And I'm originally from Connecticut. I've been in Richmond on and off since 2009. So I always tell folks that I really found myself in Richmond. So Richmond is kind of like my hometown. Originally came here for college and then stayed for me. And I am a public educator, kind of based in higher education, but I do a lot of public arts and media making through short films. And my work is really about using film as a medium to make education theory more accessible. So telling Black stories and really seeing Black life as fine art. And in my academic work, I really think about Black joy as critical practice through science fiction, film work, and public humanities.
Wonderful. And I've come across your work, Chaz. I mean, Richmond is like 1 degree of
So
separation
small.
for people, right?
Yeah.
I worked with Ryan when they were setting up Six Picks, but so you were the Black academic in residence. Do I got that right?
Yeah. Pre-pandemic, I
Absolutely.
was the Black academic in residence. The Black academic position at Six Pick is really designed to bring in a scholar who identifies as Black that works in this space and helps with tutoring, helps curate the Black academic library, which is the library space at Six Pick that has books by Black and POC authors. I'm still very involved with Six Pick, and I technically have graduated, so I'm not necessarily going to be the Black academic anymore, but we are looking for another young emerging scholar to take over that position. But the Black academic program at Six Pick is still a thing.
Yes, absolutely. And I think I saw one of your shorts as part of Africana Film Festival as well, right? So I love this mix of community, scholar, right, and artist, right? And so that's a very, very unique but dynamic perspective. Not only do you bring, obviously, to your work and expertise, but to the city of Richmond. So why don't you just kind of tell me, how did you get into your work? Or are there pivotal or one or two pivotal moments that really shaped your connection to your work and the work that you find yourself doing today?
Yeah, I like what you said earlier about kind of the intermixing of scholarship, artists, and educator. Because for me, it's really about using interdisciplinary tools to tell Black stories, because our lives are very interdisciplinary and multifaceted and multidimensional. And so I really think it's necessary to use filmmaking, podcasting, and just media in general to make education more accessible. But at the root of my work is storytelling. I really, really believe that a lot of the blind spots within institutions that we all are somehow involved in, whether it be higher education, art spaces, public education, et cetera, is that there's just a major lack or a gap or blind spot that comes from really not learning from authentic Black stories. So everyday Black life and really thinking about who we are and what can be learned from us as Black people outside of code switching, outside of conformity and assimilation and binary ways of thinking. And so for me, I would say a pivotal moment that really happened in my life that led to the current work that I'm doing is when I first moved to Richmond, I had the opportunity to work directly with the ex-offender community, folks who were in reentry programs. And prior to Richmond, I had done some work with students who had incarcerated parents as well. And I'm a child of an incarcerated parent. And I think for so long I was, and I love that you acknowledge that too, because it's just good to, to share our stories and to have that type of representation, because I think for so long I was conditioned to not talk about that. And I think when I got to working at Boys and Ruth. I was one of their volunteers through the Bonner Scholars Program.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got to work directly with that community and hear those stories from their
Mm.
voice, I feel like it took away a lot of like guilt and shame that I had about who I was. And also it made me realize that I was pushing a part of my identity and a part of my story kind of down, and I didn't really want to do that. And so having an opportunity in college to not just like study criminal justice, which was my major in undergrad, that didn't give me the opportunity to really learn from folks' stories and be able to like kind of engage in a reciprocal relationship where we were able to share stories in a non-judgmental way. And I also
Yeah.
just realized that from having a parent who was in the system, there's so much to be learned when we see those folks as scholars of their own experience.
Mm.
Instead of like studying criminology at a space like University of Richmond where I was. And because I had a life experience that connected to the system, I was always feeling like there's just something missing from what I'm studying. And I think that for me, it definitely was a pivotal moment being able to not just do service work that like, made the community better, but to gain a reciprocal relationship where I was learning and exchanging knowledge and exchanging stories through the work that I was doing in the community. And I think that kind of root in storytelling is really what
Yeah.
motivates a lot of the work that I do is how do I use media, education, the resources at these universities to make sure that the world is learning from stories, in particular black stories that often go unheard.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I love the integration of self that emerges
Mm-hmm.
with those storytellings of I was talking to somebody else the other day about another project I'm working on, and I was like, it's one thing to think about these large scale issues from like a social policy, social movement, but these things are actually happening to people
Mm-hmm.
in people's lives. And it's another thing to really integrate that of like, yeah, this is what's going on in the world, but it's actually affecting people's lives. And here's how, and bringing those things together. Because sometimes we think about, oh, these faraway policy or this is what's going on. But no, let's integrate that to say like it's impacting people's lives. And I love the integration of self of like, oh, I was serving this, but not connected to my own story. But when I
Mm-hmm.
connected to my own story, it made me connect greater with other people's story, and that just has some wonderful power to it. And I love
Mm-hmm.
that integration of self that you brought to that particular aspect of yourself. And
Yeah.
then how did you connect that to, because film is another way of storytelling. So how did you? I'm just curious. How did you sort of bridge that and get into that particular medium?
Yeah, I mean, the integration of self is so I write a lot about just like the personal as political. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think as a black person, as a black gay man that's in academia, my body and, my existence is often politicized, and I'm often working for people or with people that just like do not understand my experience or what it took for me to get to where I am. And there's like so much around like diversity and inclusion to get people like me into the higher ed space, but there's not a lot
Yeah.
of resources to keep us there to help us feel a sense of belonging. And so for me, I always tell people, even after folks watch my film work, I always say like, I'm not a sound engineer, but I have a really great podcast, and I'm not a trained filmmaker, but I make films because I just think that these tools are, for me, they're kind of like an apparatus to make education more accessible. I think film is a very like collaborative medium. And for me, even though I'm a geek and I love to read and I love education, I also have like severe ADHD. And so I'm not someone that can just like, be tucked away into the library and work on a research paper. I have to be able to like see it, to hear it, to
Tactile.
touch it, to move. I do a lot of dance. Even though I studied criminal justice, I did a lot of dance in college. Like the work has to kind of have a lot of different like textures for me. And I think that's just because my work is so informed by my life experience, which has
Yeah.
always been, my aunt Sharon's table is a learning place. Her kitchen table
I love
is a place of storytelling. So for me, I always thought that film was just a way to hold myself accountable, to keep the work accessible, but then also to like not push down the folks in my life that, or the stories in my life that I also feel are worthy of being learned from. And so I use film because it allows me to work with various like senses and tell stories through visual arts, through spoken word, and also because it's just inherently collaborative.
Yes, I love that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's transition a bit to the second question. I asked the first question because just of all of what you said, like
Mm-hmm.
we can expound upon these really difficult problems, but I fundamentally want to know who the person I is and talking, who you are that I'm talking to, and like
Mm-hmm.
what inspired you. Because if I understand your story, then I can understand your perspective on whatever issue that we're talking about. So you've been in Richmond since 2009. So my math is bad. So that's about 12 years or so, right? So
I
you've seen
think,
a
yeah.
lot, right?
I've seen a
You've
lot
been
of
a
changes. Yeah, I've definitely
yeah.
seen. I live in Jackson Ward in Richmond, and
Mhm.
I love living here because I grew up in the suburbs of Connecticut. So like, I just didn't grow up around like black folks, right? So I love to be able to leave my neighborhood and just like see black people. That's just important to me. But yeah,
I get
Richmond
it.
has changed a lot since I've been here in 2009.
Yeah, and so what are some of like two or three of the biggest inequities that you see just being some those so many perspectives you bring, but what are the kind of a couple
So I wrote some answers, but I'm also trying to just like have a kiki with you too. So I'll go back and
yeah.
forth. But in my field of work specifically, like I was thinking about this before we got on the call, and I feel like from being in public arts in the nonprofit sector, by way of kind of being nestled in academia, an inequity that I definitely see is just a lack of sustainability for Richmond-based
Mm,
talent. I think a
mm,
lot of the major institutions that are here that I work with, whether it be the two big universities, I feel like there's a trend with them in terms of um, a lack of persistence for the folks who are here, and then often trying to like bring people into Richmond in ways that put them in community projects or community spaces, but
mhm,
they don't always end up staying. So I think in higher ed,
mhm,
we have a lot of turnover. And so I think there's just like a lack of sustainability towards like sustaining Richmond based talent. And I'm
mm.
obviously speaking more about like, from working with VCU and U of R.
Yeah.
And I think both schools have very different challenges, but I've witnessed so much Black and POC talent in Richmond kind of come and go. And
Yeah.
there's like and shortly I'll kind of be a part of this trend as well, in terms of leaving Richmond to feel more valued by an
Mm,
institution. And then also I think that the folks who are here now need to be like more valued for like their deep relationships with people and the programs and the collaborations that they've already been doing without the help of institutions. I think that there's
mm.
still like a struggle to kind of really learn from the folks that have been on the ground in Richmond. And I think sometimes we see that a lot where it's just like the same group of folks are always kind of pushed to the center. And I think
Yep.
I can't speak on it specifically, but I do think that there's just a lack of undervaluing Richmond based talent. And then I think another inequity is just kind of like the lack of space. So for me, I would say like a pressure point has been working at a space like U of R. I just don't see like a huge connection with Richmond Public Schools in terms of
Mm.
resources. And I think again, it goes back to that trend of like bringing talent here, but not always valuing the talent that's already here. And while I know that there are several
Absolutely.
programs where both institutions are involved with public schools here, I still feel like there's more that can be done when you think of just like space. So like, I want to see more public school students really being able to utilize the university spaces here. And I'm not just talking
Mm,
about
yeah.
college tours or getting into college, because not every student is going to go to college, but I mean the physical buildings, like the sharing of the actual resources. That's been a
Yep.
big part of my kind of like positioning myself at Six Pick while I was in grad school, because I have access to resources at a space like University of Richmond, because I've been able to assimilate and have been able to get into that type of space, which can be very
Mm.
violent to Black students. That's a whole other episode. But because I've been able to position myself at Six Pick, the resources that I had access to in the university, I was able to fuel them into Six Pick through whether it be donations, getting faculty to do programs there, getting folks that want to support me to be able to buy books for my dissertation, but they're actually going to be books for Six Pick, like that kind of like what I call con artistry, that kind of making the system work for us instead of waiting for the system to work. Um, and so yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say I love that. And to me, it really talks to particularly your last point of sometimes gatekeepers, whatever that means. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
if we have are at these institutions, or these institutions are anchors in our city, how can we fling the doors open? So it's not like, oh,
Exactly. Yeah.
this type of person is over here and this type of person over here, and really fuels this tale of two cities, like one that's prospering and one is that not. And you can go from one part of the city to other and say,
And see
this is the
completely
resource
different,
area
different
and this is
challenges.
the unresourced. And there's so much space, like physical space and resources and talent and connection that exists over here
But
that
it's
is
often very
not
siloed.
yes, it's not. There should be a free flow of those things. Like, why have these institutions? They're doing great things in Richmond for Richmond, but that's not benefiting the people that actually live here from day to day over generations. And that, I think that connects what you were saying of how do we cultivate talent here, right? We don't have to import it all the time. Because if you think about the city and how it's changed and the population has changed, right? We've gotten like 30 some odd thousand people, which is like changed us demographically. But how are the people doing that have been here? Can they still stay here? Can they live in this
Can they
neighborhood?
thrive? Do they feel a sense of belonging at
Yes.
these institutions that kind of come in and during the and again, I believe that if you love a space, you should be the one that is critiquing it. And so I love higher education in the nonprofit sector, but I'm very critical of higher education and the nonprofit industrial complex. And when I talk about space, I think that space is just physical space is tied to so many inequities in Richmond. And that's just been like a central observation in my work, which I think you helped me condense it down. But it's just like, I'm really asking a question of like, who has space in Richmond, who owns space in Richmond, and what are, the kind of inner politics of space in Richmond? Because I do see like, just from living in Jackson Ward and thinking about how Jackson Ward is like the arts district, there's still so many unutilized buildings on Broad Street, but there's so many dope Black folks that are doing amazing things in Richmond who I've collaborated with that don't have ownership of physical space to do the amazing dope work that they're doing. And I want to see more mutual aid. I want to see more imaginative ways to think about real estate ownership in Richmond. I want to see, the Black folks that I have seen on the ground in Richmond, like folks who are working with me at Six Pick. I want to see us owning a building like Six Pick, right? And I'm just really interested in, as Richmond gentrifies and obviously more people buy homes here, because owning space is a big part of, solving some of these inequities. I want to see more like mutual aid and pipeline programs that are helping folks like own the space that they are doing their community work out of. Because real estate is, it's a thing. And I think that from living it, I'm speaking from a perspective of living in Jackson Ward, and I just feel like Jackson Ward is a historically Black neighborhood, but I want to see more Black people being able to buy in Jackson Ward in more accessible ways.
You and I are on the same page, right? So my background is in urban planning, and the whole thought for this kind of essay project is to think about how do we create a vision for the future of our city. In the beginning of my essay that will be included in this project, I talk about the space, right? So when I was 8, I'm going from one community across the track, and it begins to look different. And my community is Black and brown, and this community is white. It looks completely different. Anyway, the whole idea to develop about how we can institutionalized racism, and racism is written into our landscape, right? So how do we develop tools to unwrite that, right? Which we see every day, and it has to do with who owns the space. I love Richmond for the art and murals and the Black people everywhere, but do they own those particular spaces?
Yeah, and we're at
their homes.
And I just want to say real quick, like we're at a pivotal moment as like Richmond is kind of like the leading city in terms of taking down the monuments. Look at what's happening on Monument Avenue. We've been able to see kind of like, a reimagination of space through the monuments that were taken down and everything that happened at the Lee Circle, at Marcus Davis Peters Circles this year, So we are at like this moment where Richmond can really be the leader in reimagining space and letting, the community kind of decide, what to do with these spaces. And I say this because I think this conversation is really important, because as someone that works in higher education, I think that if I learned anything from having all these degrees, it's just not possible that like everybody's going to get to college and that's going to equal success. So I think we need to be, as one Black person who's already done it, I think that I want to be at tables where we're holding these institutions, whether it be the museums, the higher ed, the big schools like VCU, which is basically a real estate company because VCU's taken over everything, right? Like I want us to basically start holding these universities accountable to do more than just, help get students in for college. But what does it mean for them to be a part of, reimagining how to use their physical spaces for the folks in Richmond who need it?
Yeah, and be an integrated neighbor
Mm-hmm.
in our city, right? And so
There's just more
there's
that we can be pulling from these universities, and from the big institutions in Richmond that are apparently like leading, community work here. Side eye.
yeah. So I hear you saying you've kind of even transitioned to the next question, which is really what your vision is of this vision of a transformed Richmond where there is space owned, occupied by Black folks, right? That they have a presence, that they're transforming space, but that transformation isn't separated from ownership, and that these institutions that are big resource anchor institutions are actually helping, facilitating, open up their doors, whether it's actual space or resources or knowledge or innovation or whatever, are actually supporting the development of the whole community, not just
Not just the ones
their
that make it into college.
right, not just the ones that make it, or even their employees per se, because I feel like sometimes you can be like, okay, this is our community, but don't realize like you're part of the Richmond community and how can you join in a deeper, more invested, money invested
Mm-hmm.
way, a part of the conversation in the community. And your first point talks about, deeper sustainability and representation, right? This turnover in talent, not only in the university community, but probably in general in corporate and even nonprofit. How can we cultivate not only sustain over time for people, which I think makes probably about how do we make these places not only welcoming, but lucrative in the sense most people are probably leaving because either they weren't treated well or they're not making enough money or they're not
Mm-hmm.
respected and honored in this space. And I think that that's something that's the next phase because we're always thinking about representation,
Mm-hmm.
representation. But
And I
that's
just
just
think
one.
that there's
That's
just a
six
lot of
people here.
invisible labor that Black women in particular and Black folks that are running programs or working in community spaces have to engage in, which I think leads to a lot of burnout.
Mm,
I'm a early professor, and I already see it now that there's just certain things that I have to do, like teach the anti-racism classes, and kind of be emotionally drained in ways that people that are doing the same thing as me but are white don't have to necessarily deal with. And so we need to start reimagining what compensation looks like too, for Black folks that are working within these institutions that are rooted with white supremacy. And I think my vision, because I think we're getting to that question, I'm trying to keep myself on task.
no, you're good. I love it.
But
I like it.
my vision for racial equity in Richmond, I think, I got to quote Bell Hooks, but Bell Hooks writes this essay about like listening to the imagination of the marginalized. And for me, I always lead with
Mm,
the fact that like, I acknowledge when I'm in space, I'm a child of the incarcerated. I'm a first generation college student. And it took a lot to get me. It took a
mm,
village to get me where I am. And so I want to always honor and acknowledge all those identities because I remember a time where those parts of my story I felt
mm.
like I needed to suppress. I felt like I needed to not talk about that part of my story or not tell people where my parent was. But that allowed me to not center the learning that comes from having those experiences. And so
Yeah.
Bell Hooks talks a lot about kind of listening to the imagination of those who have been the most marginalized, whether it be Black folks, low income folks, trans folks, non binary folks, queer or disabled folks. And so I'm really interested in really seeing those individuals as architects of how we get ourselves to a better future. And so my vision would be that there's just more space in Richmond to make a reality what Black folks who are severely marginalized dream about as a mechanism
Mm,
towards building a better future that more authentically reflects listening to those who have been historically unheard.
I love that.
Yeah, it's dreamy, it's sci-fi, but I do think that there's just so much to learn from the imagination of those who have been um, unheard, and really thinking about how do we fund Black joy as a practice instead of only talking about Black joy in response to oppression and racism, because we know that
Mm,
there's more to us than our oppression and racism. And I just think that I have really been trying to center Black joy in my work as a critical practice, not only center joy in response to oppression and racism and police brutality.
Yeah, just as this is what we do. This is a piece of who we are. That's
Because
not
there's so
always.
much joy, and I think that a part of us, having to engage or work with these institutions that are rooted in white supremacy, I think that it's time for us to demand that our joy is also funded equitably too.
Ooh, I love that. Yes, fun,
You said
fund
one
my joy.
sentence, but like I can't, I'm not a one
No,
sentence
it's
kind of
like
girl. I'm sorry.
no, that's beautiful. I love that. I love the imagination. I love funding joy, particularly if you're working for institutions in the nonprofit sector.
Mm-hmm.
Like the nonprofit sector, people are characteristically overworked and underpaid, right? And that does not support
Undervalued. Yeah.
undervalue, and it doesn't support their longevity. This is really, really hard work, and folks are doing it on the ground. So
But
where
they are,
are
but they need us. They need us.
yeah,
Like we're
yeah.
in my latest film project, Everyday Black Matter. We have a quote at the end where we say, "Don't do anything for them unless they overpay you." And that
Mm,
quote is really talking about, these institutions need us, whether you're a woman and you have to engage with patriarchy to get to where you are, to get you where you want to go, or like whether you're a queer person and you've got to work in a space that's rooted in heteronormativity, whether you're non-binary and they keep messing up your pronouns but want you to come speak about, gender perspective, etc. Like, I just think it's really time for us as Black folks to not do anything for these institutions unless we are being fully valued and well compensated for it, because we didn't create this mess.
yeah, it's got what you were experiencing before. Is I have another friend that's a professor, and he calls it the black tax, right? So all
Mm-hmm.
the other
Mm-hmm.
stuff that I have to do
Mm-hmm.
in relation to my job that other folks do not have to do by virtue of me being one of very few black folks here, and it takes a tax and it takes a toll, and I'm not being compensated for.
Mm-hmm.
So I love all of the points that you're talking about, right? So if I wasn't sitting down, I'd do a little I'd do a little joy dance, right? 'Cause,
You could do a joy dance while you're sitting down.
I could do some little shoulders for
Do
you.
a little shimmy shimmy.
But let's get into what are you've kind of pointed to it even in your vision. So what are one or two or three things that you can point us to as a collective, or you can point sort of the institutions that you were talking about, whether it's academia, whether it's us, Richmond Collective, whether it's black folks, whether it's white folks here. What do
Mm-hmm.
you want to leave us with to do? Like, how can we, because this is both discussion, but like the strategy, we can bring up all
Mm-hmm.
these issues, but really pointing people, like, what are a couple of things that you feel like we can do to begin to realize the vision that you have set out for us?
I mean, I think one is to, whether you're listening and you're a colleague, a friend, a donor, or someone that's working in the nonprofit space or the education space, I think it's just important to think about your role in supporting and making the world easier for Black folks. So, what is your role in making Black joy more accessible and more possible for us? Because I don't want to just come on to these podcasts or work with institutions and just talk about racism, oppression, or diversity and inclusion. I'm done
Yeah.
with that. There's more to my Blackness than helping institutions fix their blind spots. And so, but I do
Love
think
that.
that everything that I'm saying, while my work is not completely rooted there, I do think that everything I'm saying can be connected to really ending the school to prison pipeline. And
Mm,
I I think one thing I want to leave us with too, because of where we started in this conversation, is just how are we learning from folks who have been severely impacted by the criminal justice system? So how are we setting up resources to really see those individuals as scholars, right? And really redefine or rearticulate what we mean when we think about who is criminal and who isn't criminal in a white supremacist society, right? Like
mm,
maybe some of these folks that the system has labeled as criminal, they've just found an alternative world, an alternative way to survive. And how are we learning from
mm.
them in these conversations about ending the school to prison pipeline and ending prison, in general, especially in the city of Richmond. And so I know I didn't say much about that, but I definitely want my words to inspire folks to think about how we can value and treat Black folks who have been severely impacted by the system. And then on another note, like, more residency programs that bring all types of artists and educators together in Richmond. And as we've talked
Mm.
about with space, like really funding our sustainability, not just like kind of one-off honorariums, but what does it look like to really create programs in Richmond that is funding Richmond talent and that holds institutions accountable to do more for us than just, bring us in to help them fix their blind spots. A third one that I thought about too was just, again, going back to real estate, but just, how are we taking advantage of this moment in Richmond as we are the city that's, we're under the spotlight in terms of the monuments and in terms of reimagining the city and city space in general. And I want to see more collaboration, and I want Richmond to get its due in the media in terms of being the city that is leading the conversation on monuments.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really not necessarily connected with monuments, but just connected with we have been the capital of the Confederacy. So we have the opportunity to be the capital of reimagining what it looks like to dismantle racism and reimagining our city, right? And this is Richmond, but we can think about us as emblematic of what so many cities need to do around the countries, as the seat of so much. And so can we be the seat of hope, innovation, reimagining what our cities can look like, right? Because if we could go from something that's really divided to a model for change. And this, right, for me, this project is saying I interact with so many people like yourself. They're just brilliant, right? And so getting their ideas out, getting their strategies, getting their voice in this multimedia format, right? Not everybody has to be, of course, you're a good doctor there, right? Not everybody has to be, which is great, right? Not everybody has to be that, but they've been working, they have great ideas, and everybody's so multifaceted and multidimensional. So how do you capture both the voice, which I think you did great, of like your voice of where you come from and what's influenced you, but then all of the places that your identity in your experience hit, bring that together, and then bring that together into like, what then should we do, right?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just like, we're in that phase right now of what then should we do, and this is part of what this conversation is trying to do, of getting to know folks, getting to know their expertise, perspective, but then helping them to inform the city about what then should we do.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, like, it's my intention to sound kind of dreamy and imaginative, because I think that our imagination as Black folks is constantly undervalued. And I know that what has gotten me through a lot of the stuff that you have to deal with to get through graduate school or to work in the nonprofit sector as, as the one or the only or one of few, like, is really having that imagination and really being able to think about how you can use the resources in ways that serve you and serve the people that are in your community more effectively. And so I do want folks that are listening to really think about, their role in funding Black dreams and Black futures. And I think that can't happen unless we, end the school to prison pipeline. And it also can't happen if we continue this path of only listening to certain types of Black folks, right? So as you said, right. Richmond being the capital of the Confederacy, we are at a pivotal moment where we could be, the city that really leads this change. I think that can't happen unless we have, an appreciation and a value, and we fund, multidimensional Black stories and have a plethora of individuals at whatever table that is, not just the ones that, fit within the respectability narrative.
Yeah, we could definitely get caught up in, I don't know, it's probably everywhere, but the couple people that are the go-to folks, and how to, again, do you open the door for more voices, more people, and not just the chosen few, because we all have a say, and even cultivating those voices, right? Cultivating of who else has something to say. And I try to do with this project, probably could do a better job of having both, of like, hey, we want to hear from people that we always hear from, because that's good, but how do we hear from folks that we may not hear from as much, that have a different perspective? So I really appreciate you coming and sharing your multidimensional perspective, and, as an artist, as a scholar, as someone who's been a student and now working here, building community, and just seeing Richmond from different perspectives, because that's what we need, right? Because we're not a one-dimensional place. We're not one-dimensional people, and these are not one-dimensional problems, to say the least.
And
So
what's kept me like super rooted in dreams is working with youth. I think whatever you do, whether you're in corporate America, nonprofit, whatever, you should always have some kind of outlet or output or whatever the word is in your work built in, where you're listening and learning from young people. I can't be a good professor if I'm not learning from my students. And the same thing at Six Pick. Like, you've been to Six Pick before too. Like, the youth that walk through Six Pick, like, they make sure that their voice is heard. And I think when we include them in conversations like this, it allows us to really think about change in ways that surpass even our blind spots.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
This is fun.
See, I told you.
You got me thinking about lots of stuff.
It's pretty painless, but as we, it's been great to chat with you, Chaz. See, I told you it's going to be painless. It's pretty just chatting it up about issues that you care about, that you know about, of your particular perspective. So I thank you for being on today, but also just wanted to give you, before I close, last chance to say anything that you haven't said, highlight something that's really important to you that you want to leave our listeners with, or anything that you'd like to say in closing before we wrap up.
I just want to say, thank you to everybody, especially you, Ebony, that's doing amazing work in Richmond to center, change and really think about this reimagination of things, so that in this current moment of pandemic and racial reckoning, we don't go back to, operating with business as usual in Richmond. And then I think for folks that are interested in hearing more about what I have to say, you can always listen to me at Black Matter Podcast, which is on all platforms wherever you get your podcasts. And for folks who want to contribute to what I have to say, you can always send me a Cash App or a Venmo at Chaz-Antoine. And you can also support Six Points Innovation Center through donating books by Black authors to the Black Academic Library, or making a cash donation.
Wonderful. And I hope you all can follow up with Chaz and those handles, or fund his Black Joy, which I fully appreciate. I'm going to have to use that one. Thanks again, Chaz, for coming on to another episode of Racial Equity in Richmond. This is a component of the Richmond Racial Equity Essays Project, where we're asking folks from all walks of life in Richmond to cast a vision for racial equity and tell us from their perspectives how to get there. So continue to listen and on next episodes, but bye-bye for now.
Thanks.